Hello, and welcome to Movies We Did, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're digging into Thor, Love and Thunder, a 2022 MCU film, the fourth in the Thor franchise, starring Chris Hemsworth, Natalie Portman, and I imagine we'll talk a lot about Russell Crowe.
Oh, yeah.
Also, we are joined here today by a very special guest, Dr. Jason Nethercut, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of South Florida. Jason, we're really excited. You were actually kind of one of the top on our short list for, strangers that I'm reaching out to ask to be on the show. So welcome. We're glad to have you.
I'm very happy to be here.
Nice. Okay. Well, where are we starting? So we usually start with our guests. So we'll just kind of preliminary, Jason, do you dig this movie? And what's your feeling on Thor?
So I do. More than most people, my impression is that most people did not. But I would say in the scheme of things, this is not one of the better movies in the MCU. But if you can just take a step back from that and look at it on its own terms, I think it does some really cool stuff. Very much in the spirit of Taika. And I imagine we'll talk a lot about that as well. But to me, it's very curious that it was, there's all this run up to it and everyone was so excited about it. And then there was like no conversation about it whatsoever. Right. So that to me is the very curious thing. So maybe that's what we're doing today is like finally taking account. But yeah, so it's hard for me to ever not like something in the MCU. So maybe I'm not the best person to ask.
Okay. I want to preface this by I love Taika Waititi so much. I did not dig this movie. I will be the voice of the negative voice here. And maybe you guys will convince me to like it by the end, as you usually do. But I loved Ragnarok. And I love most things Taika Waititi. Like Our Flag Means Death was one of the funniest things that I've watched this year. But this just like kind of tonally hit wrong for me. And I think there were some parts of it that I enjoyed, but I don't know. It just didn't strike a chord with me. And yeah, I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah, I'm kind of... I don't know if I would say I did not dig it or I did dig it. I enjoyed it. I had high expectations after Ragnarok because they had taken the Thor story in such a different direction, in such a good direction. Like, I enjoyed that one so much. And it felt like this time it leaned a little too heavy into the like humor side, which I think Chris Hemsworth can do really well, but I don't know, it got weird. I will say, like, it was also, this movie was so fun because this was like one of the first movies that Andy and I went to in person since the pandemic has come out. So like seeing the screaming goats on large screen was an experience definitely worth enjoying.
I love it.
And it was visually really cool looking, and all of the god elements I think could have been so interesting, but it seemed disjointed in some ways too. So I it's a real toss-up for me of like, I know I like Ragnarok. I really enjoyed that, and this one is just like, it didn't hit the mark in the same way.
Yeah, I'm very similar. I think I'm probably closest maybe to Christy, where Ragnarok is probably in my it's probably in my top 5 of all the MCU films. I really enjoyed it. I like pretty much everything Taika Waititi has done, What We Do in the Shadows. My personal favorite is Hunt for the Wilder People. I think that's his sort of secret masterpiece. But yeah, there was something about, I think like particularly, I was so excited for this one because Ragnarok, was so well received and I liked it, and Taika's kind of really coming into his own. But like, I think, yeah, Christy, you were kind of, there is something a little weird. Like there's maybe like 10% too much levity or bathos or whatever you want to call it, of just like goofiness that kind of undercuts kind of maybe what the movie is trying to do, or it makes it sort of hard to reconcile. But at the same time, like it was still like it was a pretty good movie, and like I enjoyed a fair amount of it. Although like I think my impression of the kind of general reception was like maybe it was like not for everyone. The humor was maybe a bit much. Maybe it needed to be scaled back. I'm not sure if we all agree, like to what extent we sort of agree. But I guess like my first sort of kind of question, I guess, for people is, I guess, maybe on the tone, because like Thor, from when we first saw him, or at least Chris Hemsworth is Thor, when we first saw him in like 2012, was that the first Thor movie?
Is it really that long ago? Wow.
Is has changed a lot from what this Thor, right? From the Kenneth Branagh era, when there was kind of a gravitas to Thor to what we're getting now. And so I guess my first kind of question is like the arc of this Thor, and this Thor kind of as like a mythical figure, because one of the hardest things about adapting Thor is like it's from myth, and it's all very like almost Shakespearean. I mean, that's why they got Kenneth Branagh, but like it seems hard to kind of pitch at like a general 4-quadrant movie going audience. The first question is always the toughest, because it's like once we get into it, then we're rolling. But like,
is there an order?
I mean, whatever. Like, I threw a lot down on the floor right there, into the stage, as Russell Crowe would call it.
Yeah, stage. Yeah, I mean, so I just have this. Well, I'm going to talk about your question, but I was just thinking too that I think part of the issue with the movie, in many ways, because I 100% agree with everything everyone said about Ragnarok and Taika in general. It's kind of like he's boxed himself in, Taika, I mean, because he's so excellent, right? And he did such an amazing job with Ragnarok, which by my count is certainly in the top 3 of the MCU, that it's like, at a certain point, he's fighting against himself. And so this wasn't as good as Ragnarok. But again, I think it's probably not one of the better movies in the MCU, but it's in the middle. Right? It's no Thor 2.
I was about to say, are we gonna invoke Thor the Dark World?
I'm not trying to, play my cards too openly here, but it's not something like that, right? So anyway, I think that might have been part of it. But it's true, like I do think with Ragnarok, it's up there in terms of the visual side of things, one of the better films they've done, because it's the same idiom basically, with the color schemes and music, right, is obviously important for him too. So, and then the other thing I was going to say is that Christian Bale in this movie, I think, goes up there in the top 3 villains we've seen in the MCU. I thought he was so excellent in it, right? So that was another part of it. So it's true. It's like it's very disjointed, the film, because there are parts of it that are just excellent. And some of the funniest parts are some of the funniest things that have been done. But it's just, it's kind of uneven. But to the question you asked, though, I was thinking about this, like, it does seem that over the course of the last decade, we've sort of gone from a Thor that is, as you said, epic Shakespearean mythological figure into one who is one of the funniest characters in the MCU. He's normally played for comic relief. In the later Avengers films, that's almost always how it is. But what's so interesting is he does that, but it's also difficult to find a character in those movies who has dealt with more tragedy, right? Like it's like this terrible stuff has happened to this guy. And again, there's so much complexity going on with what has happened before Love and Thunder. And it's like none of that was cashed in, right? That was the thing. It's like, in fact, what it was flattened out to the point where they took all that angst and pain that Thor had in Infinity War and Endgame. That was amazing, right? And it was so true. In a way that you don't go to the MCU for like edifying expositions on the human condition, but like Thor gives it to you, right? And they just flattened it out and was like, oh, he's sad because whatever.
Like that first monologue, they're like, oh, then his mom dies, then his dad dies, then his brother dies like 3 times, and then it kind of like reduces it all, and then like, oh, and his girlfriend broke up with him, and then like I wrote, one of my notes was like, can Thor experience any more trauma? Is like with a question mark. I just kind of put, and it almost becomes like, I mean, I guess in a way that's kind of very true to myth, right? Because one of the things, at least about like sort of in a old like Greek, Norse kind of classical myth idea, like one of the things about heroes is that they just experience more and suffer more than like regular people ever can or would. But I sort of digress. I've already hijacked it.
Well, I I was wondering because like we haven't really had a chance to talk about Eternals yet, and I think we're going to at some point. But I'm wondering if like some of this is that Thor being a god, and that's like what his superpowers resonate from, and that was what was good about this film is like he's lost, right, in terms of what is his purpose anymore. Because oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of his home planet. All of this
Asgard.
Asgard. Why? Okay, struggle today. Asgard's gone, and New Asgard is being run by a Valkyrie, and he's not really working with the Avengers anymore, and he's obviously not really wanted with the Guardians. And it does feel like he's kind of lost purpose, and maybe that was part of it. It's like his character doesn't have a clear purpose at the moment, and that's something hard to depict. But I think we're also starting to, we're going to get mutants. We're going to get X-Men at some point. We have all of these superheroes being generated in different ways. And now we're trying to throw in, like, Thor's always been there as a mythological figure, but like trying to throw in mythological gods who were the superheroes of these old stories. I think it gets very jumbled and lost because, I've commented, this is DC, but The Flash is based on his Hermes in a lot of ways and the way he's depicted and things like that. So when that was the original inspiration for superheroes, do mythological gods get lost as a result?
This is kind of, if you see, I think one of the end credit scenes, that's kind of what Zeus is going on about. Like he says something that it's like, it used to be us, now it's all these caped superhero, whatevers. And I guess that's also the first question that I kind of, in my like final wrap up thoughts, my first question, something that I kind of really beat my head against the wall with, is also like in this world where you have mutants and Asgardians and now the Olympians and the Immortals and Celestials and whatever Thanos is. I guess he's like a Titan, whatever that means. But like my question is like, what is a god in this world? Because that seems like that's like a core question, because Gore's whole thing is like kill all gods.
Kill all gods.
And so what is a god in the schema of the MCU, I guess? Because that was one of the things that kind of, I think, was a thing that sort of prevented me from getting all in, because I'm like, well, is Sif a god? Is Valkyrie a god? Or is it just Thor? Are all Asgardians gods? Like, what about the Eternals?
Well, if you like go even further, like, is the Hulk a god? Like, is Captain America a god? Like, they've been manufactured, but like they have these god-esque powers, and they sort of are exalted by people and worshipped in a certain way. And so I think that's like a really interesting question that I think could have been pushed quite a lot in this movie on like what determines a god and like what is the responsibility of a god. Because I agree that I really loved Christian Bale's character. This, like, that was a terrifying, but also like you really, really felt for that villain. And I think those are the best villains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
he's not wrong, right? Like
he's not wrong.
But again, an MCU villain who I'm uncomfortably in agreement with about a lot of things they say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, well, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that like pushing that line further on like what do you mean and what do you want when you say kill all gods is a much bigger question, especially in the MCU. And I feel like one that I don't have an answer to. Right?
I don't think the MCU really has an answer. And I think this is not necessarily like the movie's fault or anything like that, because the movies have been really inconsistent about it. Like in the first like two Thors, the line they seem to be towing is that like they're called gods and they were worshipped in, ancient times by human beings, but they're like these Asgardians, they're really just like very powerful, technologically advanced space people. Mm-hmm. There's almost like an Ancient Aliens kind of element to it in that way. Like I think at one point in the second Thor, Loki or Odin says something to the effect of like, we're not gods, even though we live, a thousand years longer and we're much stronger than people. We're still, we're still like mortals. But then in like Ragnarok, it really sort of, it kind of goes the other way on it. And Thor's like, I am the god of thunder. That's my thing.
Yeah. Well, so it's an interesting question, because if you're looking for ancient comparanda for what the MCU's function is, well, what we're sort of circling the big issue, right? Which is the whole reason. I mean, this is Myth 101. I literally teach student my myth classes, is that what these stories are really about are about humanity and humanity's about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to understand, or at least to get your head around what makes somebody a god versus a human. And in the MCU, it's true that it's difficult to sort of see how that works. And it gets even further complicated now that we have actual
Mm-hmm.
Greco-Roman figures who have a whole literary tradition, artistic tradition that circles these same exact questions being thrown into the mix. Because before this movie, I would have said the most like godlike figure that we see. Well, I guess the Eternals kind of blew that up, but I was going to say Ego. Of course, he is
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
involved in the Eternals side of things too. But yeah, so he seems to be more like what we would, if we were looking at an analog in Greco-Roman mythology for like divinity versus
Mm-hmm.
humanity. Well, Ego is the closest that could approximate to that. And his
Yeah.
attitude certainly looks a lot like what certain gods look like in Greek tragedy or Ovid's Metamorphoses or works like this, where it's a complete indifference to these lesser creatures and all of their pain and suffering.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's sort of, obviously we can nuance that, but
Yeah.
that's sort of, and so what I'm very interested in with especially Eternals and what's going to happen now with whatever phase we're in. I guess we're still in phase 4.
I think so. Yeah.
Clear to
Yeah, I
me.
think it's wrapping up.
Is how that's going to be sort of the table's going to be reset about that kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
And so we'll see what happens.
I have like so many thoughts, and I think again part of this is like the kind of, I mean, we're talking like in like when we teach in our classes, like the idea of like kind of like the textual or transmission history of a lot of these stories, and a lot of it's just because of the like successive layers of comic books, you know, from all the way back to the 60s, because kind of like in the, you know, and I guess in like to sort of paint with a really broad brush in the MCU, kind of one of the baseline sort of like givens is that like basically like all the major pantheons are real. Like, you know, Odin can pop over to Olympus to talk to Zeus. They can pop over to talk to Indra or Central American gods or who, you know, all there's all these gods kind of out there, and like they're real. But then in like the comic history, and as you sort of integrate all these different comic traditions, it gets really complicated, because then there's like Jack Kirby gets into his whole like the Eternals, and like these beings who are like god adjacent or maybe inspired gods. So you have figures like, so you have both Athena, who's like kind of the inspiration for Athena, but also Athena is like, they're like simultaneously two people that exist in the same world, and so
Right.
that becomes like, you know, a little bit of cognitive dissonance, because like both of these ideas like have a hard time cohabitating. But just kind of come back to the initial question is like, I think maybe a thesis I'll put forward, that which you can accept or reject, is in this kind of schema, it seems like the key to gods is one, having power, but not just having power, but also being worshipped sort of as gods. And I think like Zeus says something where he's like, well, like where who had the most humans sacrificed to them this year, or like, you know,
Right.
it's about, for Zeus, it seems to be really much about worship. And again, to get back to sort of Jason's point, when these are about humans, like a lot of gods in stories like Hesiod or Ovid or Homer or whatever are very analogous to just powerful humans, you know, kings and emperors, and that connection is sometimes made very explicit. But yeah, it's like, so is a god just a powerful person who is worshipped as such, as opposed to some kind of intrinsic quality, you know, of that makes one a god versus just an Eternal or a Hulk or a super soldier?
I have a thought to add on that, because I agree with your premise. And I think to put it further, because what I appreciate about this movie is that Gore becomes the god killer by killing a god that none of us would recognize as a god. So like part of me is wondering, especially because Zeus is in charge of this pantheon of all the gods, it's like, all right, is this very like being defined by humans? But like we're already showing there's various other aliens all around the world. And that's what I like, that this movie very much established that there are gods that are unknown to humans that still fit this motif. So going back to like Hesiod and things like that, maybe what defines a god is not only being powerful and worshipped, but also the belief that that individual or that entity or group of entities had a hand in creating a group of people. So creating humanity.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that they're like foundational in some way.
Yeah, which isn't necessarily shown in the movie, but to me, that's how I would define the difference between those who were considered gods versus those who are just superheroes.
Ooh.
No, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Certainly, like the idea that of ego, right, goes right along with that, right? Differentiates him.
And then I guess also, well, like, not to, like, we've been talking a lot about not a weird amount, but maybe it was predictable, but like, because again, like the Eternals and everything in that movie kind of complicates things, but like the Celestials, because like in the MCU, there's like these kinds of gods, like gods of Earth and whatever planet, but then there's also these like higher cosmic beings, like the Celestials, who kind of go around making planets. And then at the very end, in this movie, we see Eternity, who in the Marvel kind of comic verse is like the closest approximate to like a capital G god. Like,
right.
It's everything. It's infinite, all matter and energy and whatever. Like, it's kind of, that's what Eternity is. He's not so much like a lowercase G god like Zeus or Odin. He's kind of a more like cosmic entity force.
Eternity and Infinity too, right?
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
Infinity the other one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's cool because riffing on what Christy was saying about Hesiod, I mean, that's sort of the basic, I don't know if you would call it a theology of the MCU, but the basic cosmogony for sure looks very Hesiodic, right? You've got these sort of abstract forces at play that predate and give rise to everything else, and they're still in the mix. So it's like in the theogony, one of the big forces is Eros, gives rise to everything. And obviously, I mean, throughout the rest of that work and just throughout Greek mythology as well, like obviously that's still a force that's at play in the same way that infinity and eternity are as well. So, I mean, I don't know the history of this as well as I should. I'm sure that you all know this better than I do, but I have always assumed that the people who made the Marvel comic universe were very well versed in Greco-Roman mythology primary sources, but I don't have any way to prove that except just it seems impossible to me that they wouldn't have been.
Or, I mean, I guess maybe the counterpoint, or it's just this kind of idea was big. I mean, a lot, like particularly like in the 60s, where a lot of these Marvel characters coming out, they are very steeped in both in like world mythologies. So like we get like Thor and also Hercules are like prominent and Marvel characters, but then also like mysticism and the occult. So like Doctor Strange is kind of born out of all that. Sure. And they're very much into these, like world religions and myth systems and belief systems. So absolutely, whether or not it's, Jack Kirby was reading or Stan Lee was reading, Hesiod's Theogony or not, but like these ideas I think are very much like baked into the world that they're dipping into and pulling from.
Makes sense.
I had another question, but it's escaped me at this point.
I was gonna say, should we actually just talk about Russell Crowe as Zeus? I guess I started talking about Gore, so we can finish our villain.
So good. Gore. Most of this movie is kind of based on a comic run or a series of Thor runs by Jason Aaron, where he's got the Mighty Thor with Jane Foster and also Gore the God Butcher, though they're not quite coterminous, although they're sort of related. But yeah, Gore is actually he's of the comic villains we've seen, he's pretty similar to how he shows up in the comic books, where the same premise, where basically he's from like a dying planet that he felt the gods abandoned, and even though he was faithful, then he gets this artifact, the Necro Sword, and then he goes around murdering all pantheons. And the comic's really cool because actually Thor encounters him at like different points of his life. Like there's like a young Thor meets him in like the Middle Ages, and then he later meets him like adult Thor in like the 20th century, and then old Thor at like the end of time like fights him again, which is all pretty cool. It's worth checking out. But
sure.
But yeah, no, Jason, you mentioned he's another one of these villains. I imagine probably like Killmonger or Thanos, where it's like I kind of find myself like he's like I do agree with him. Not these gods.
Yeah, they've got a point. Their methods are very questionable.
Yeah,
but the basic thesis is pretty accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I find even at the end when he sort of, has his, like, you're not looking for revenge, you're just looking for love. It's like, well, of course. Like
Mhm.
that's of course that's what everyone is looking for. And like, speaking of, going through so much trauma and tragedy, it's like this man has been through this enormous tragedy, and it's sort of, yeah, how his methods that he has decided to like use this power that he has that is maybe questionable, but so powerful and like a great villain.
That gives me actually a thought of that. Well, so one of the conceits of the Necro Sword is that it also, in using it, it corrupts its user, which leads to a kind of thematic parallel where on the other side, we've got Jane Foster, who picks up the hammer and becomes Thor and is incredibly powerful. But in doing so, it strips her body of the ability to fight. Spoilers: Jane Foster is dying of cancer, and so there's kind of a parallel there, right, between Jane and the hammer and Gore and the sword, right, where like
Mhm.
using these things to get power to get what you want also corrupts and kills you, or something
Right.
to that extent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's like kind of painfully real in so many ways, and I think could have maybe shown through a lot more without some of the overlaying humor.
Yeah, right. So that's just coming back to the issue with the film, right? That's a part of it, is that it's dealing with some very serious stuff.
Very heavy topics.
And that kind of is not Taika's thing, you know? I
Hmm.
mean,
Did
well, I,
JoJo land for you? I guess
I
that's
guess, yeah,
the.
Jojo Rabbit, I guess, sort of had
that's true.
like,
But JoJo, I think of his movies, that one worked least for me,
Yeah.
barring this one. I think kind of I don't know. It wasn't quite as like the overlay. They weren't like
mhm.
this movie can't go like 2 seconds without some kind of.
With the hammer and his new weapon, like duking it out, or
I want to get back to the hammer thing later, but
yeah.
yeah.
And I also question of, the time this came out, because like it's obvious that MCU plans out so many of these movies very far advanced now, but speaking to this time of destruction of planet and or death from disease coming out when it does, and how that can lead people to question faith, in particular.
Mhm.
How much of that at the time it came out is like, we've had to struggle with this for a few years now, and we're continuing to struggle with it. And maybe we can make it a little more lighthearted to address it, or how much of it is tied to, the original comics and not being able to wiggle out of that. So I am interested in just like why this storyline at this time, how intentional or unintentional was that? Because I think that has a lot to do with it too. Because like no one wants a huge downer of a movie again. What was that Netflix one of Don't Look Up, where it's like it's very
Yeah.
serious and
Yeah.
Yeah.
and cataclysmic, but it's also being funny about it, because what else can you do at this point?
Right.
This isn't quite an answer to your question, but I think is maybe like the perfect metaphor where there's a part when we cut to the first time to New Asgard, and there is an ice cream store called Infinity Cones with like the glove and the ice cream cone. But I'm like, in this world, I feel like that would be like a 9/11 themed ice cream store, right? Like this is like a real like people like half the universe blipped out and people lost, people died and people lost people, and it was a really horrible event like in pretty recent memory, and like now there's an ice cream store about it, like. And I feel like that is like almost like a metaphor for this movie, just kind of like maybe wanting to just plaster over something really intense and heavy and traumatic with a pun or something
Yeah.
goofy.
Yeah, but to me, that's like actually sort of super emblematic of some of the issues here, because in my opinion, the best things that have come in phase 4 have been ones that have dug in really deep to that trauma that must have happened in this universe after Thanos, after
Hmm.
Endgame. And so, like especially WandaVision,
Yeah.
obviously. So I mean, I guess you can do it either way, but yeah, I don't know. I think that the more I've thought about it, the more that's one of the issues I have with this, is that he just he didn't nail the tone, and he did nail the tone so well with Ragnarok.
Hmm.
And I don't know, maybe it's because I've been watching too much of What We Do in the Shadows. So it's hard because that is so exceptional, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it's not fair to him because they're not the same thing, but I am in my head just ticking off, this isn't as good as that, right?
Yeah, but there's kind of, I mean, well, I take that. I was about to say there's kind of less at stake with Ragnarok, but then I'm like, well, no, not really, because like Thor's whole planet blows up, right? And
Yeah.
so, but
Yeah, that one got real serious towards the end.
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, it is an apocalypse. Like,
hmm
and his dad dies, and like, it's big. I feel
yeah,
like
the end of a civilization, kind
it
of.
also deals with some really heavy things, especially I think on like the violence side of things, of like Hela being like this
Hmm
extremely violently based powerhouse, and sort of the difference between the comic relief and the violence in that movie, which is pretty extensive if I remember.
And like colonialism, because kind of the whole
Yes.
reveal is that like Odin was a conqueror, and then he I don't know, got cold feet or and then had to put Hela away. But like they, the Asgardians were just these like conquering peoples, and everybody kind of wants to pretend that that's not their history, or they want to pretend that that's not their history, even though it very much is part of their history.
Just
Which
very
I think that
appropriate.
movie, I think, handled with the right kind of gravitas is not the right word I want to use, but like with a sensitivity to that. I think, I don't know. It's almost like Love and Thunder almost feels like kind of uncomfortable with its own serious sort of things, but
Yeah.
in the same way that I guess like Thor kind of can't really handle, he can never really talk about his own trauma. He always like is acting goofy around it or something like that. He's like, there's a lot of deflection happening with
Mhm.
Thor himself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was almost contemplating the idea, though, that maybe what we're seeing here, because he went through so much trauma in all the other films, that, and especially at the very beginning, because, he's meditating, he's searching for himself, all of that, it's like maybe he's actually developed resilience. And we don't see that a lot. Like, what does it look like to take these tragic events and accept them and know that you have to move on to the next thing? Like, he loses Jane, and now there's a child he needs to take care of, and he fully embraces that. And maybe that's like why it hits wrong, because like we don't get to see a model of resilience a lot of times in films and things like that. We're here for the tragedy and heartbreak and trying to build yourself back up, but not to actually see what it looks like of someone who has developed some resilience to these things that happen, because a lot has happened to them.
Yeah. I mean, not to put too much of a this is a evocation of Greek literature point on it, but this is
Kind of the whole conceit of this
right.
show, so you're
But
good.
one way to think about all of this, right, is that more or less what you get in Endgame is Thor being resurrected out of basically where Achilles is in the Iliad, and it ends more or less. I mean, you see him at, sorry, spoiler alert, you see him at Tony's funeral, but you don't really get any resolution to the fact that all he really gets is the revenge he's seeking, right?
Mhm.
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 And so now it's like Thor 4 is what would happen if Homer had told a story about Achilles after he had his resolution with Priam and then went off and like had to live his life in some other way, right? I mean, it's sort
Mhm.
of like that is the moment you're looking at for this character arc. And it's weird because, that's not what you would expect given the models that are available from European literature. Not that those are the models you have to bring to bear on it, but so anyway, again, just sort of reinforcing that. Yeah, I think what Christy was saying was absolutely right. It's a curious thing.
It's the issue of watching our heroes grow old when they don't usually get to do that.
It's also like the medium fighting against itself, right? Because like
Yeah.
in a 3 hour, or a 3 hour movie, not 3 hours, I guess, in a 2.5 hour movie or whatever, you want an arc, you want a resolution, you want the character to reach a point of completion. But also the model of the MCU is like, well, we need like 12 of these things, right?
Right.
Or like Thor's going to
Yeah.
show up in 6 more things.
Right.
So like any resolution that happens in the, Thor 2 or Thor 3 or whatever, like kind of has to inevitably get undone, so he can show. I mean, I like maybe the best example of this, in at least for the MCU, is not the Thor movies, but Iron Man 3 is like kind of a perfect coda to Iron Man.
Yeah.
But the problem is he needs to come back for Avengers
Right.
2 or whatever it is. Him giving up all the suits at the end of Iron Man 3 is kind of rendered null and void because we need Iron Man back in the suit in 6 to 8 months.
Right. Yeah.
That's another one that's great though. That's like just sort of digging into PTSD, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is more or less what Thor's whole character is like this guy just has walking PTSD. What's going to happen with him? It's interesting that you brought up Iron Man 3.
And also a thing about Thor that is paid lip service to occasionally, but I think is also maybe there's more fruit on that tree, is that Thor is something like 1,500 years old, right? And I don't know, like the perspective of somebody who has lived that long. And I guess the idea is kind of for most of it, he was just kind of jerking around. It's only in the last decade or so where he's really kind of matured to any extent.
Right.
If you can imagine a millennium of Thor from Thor 1, pre-Jane Foster.
Just being a teenage
or Thor,
asshole.
the Thor that you meet in What If.
Yeah.
That's so good.
Oh my gosh.
Which in a sense is... Oh, sorry, go Christy.
Oh, finish your thought, because I was going to say that might be a good segue to like heroes getting old / gods getting old. It might be a good segue.
That's exactly where I was kind of going. Thor in myth is this kind of... he is kind of like early Thor 1 Thor, where he's just, he's going around, I want to fight giants, I want to drink a bunch, he's going to get up to trouble. He's always up to his old kind of tricks. And that's, I think, a lot of, just myths is they're a lot of mythological figures tend to be a little bit static, right? Because they just keep reappearing in stories or in an oral tradition or something like that. We're just like, we're all on the same baseline of like what Thor's about, right? Or Heracles as just another very kind of like, Heracles is also a very kind of complex figure, much like Thor in terms of trauma and experiences and things like that. But like, we all need to be on the same baseline of like who this guy is and like what he's about. And so, sometimes that maybe that is a good opportunity for like more long form, arc based storytelling, or sometimes it cuts against it. And I'm not sure where I kind of, my thought is kind of unraveling as I say it.
Unraveling. That's a Bugs Bunny phrasing right
there.
That's
an
rabbit right there.
I'm unraveling right here.
Well, should we talk about the giant man-child in the ring? Just Zeus, played by Russell Crowe, which I don't know if I could have casted any better, except his version of a Greek accent is the most atrocious thing I've ever heard.
I both love and hate it, and I can't like decide where I'm falling, because I think the like kitschy weirdness of it somehow works, like this kind of aging, almost like gaudy Vegas version of Zeus, who's like hanging out with like, with girls and like has a throne and has his thunderbolt, and it like that works so well. But yeah, the accent and just the voice, I was like, what's happening?
I feel like he should have been the one to voice Mario, because that was a closer sounding Mario voice.
Oh, God.
Oh, we can't even start.
You can't open that box.
I know. Please keep that box closed right now.
Fair enough. So like we've talked a lot about Zeus and how we depict him in a lot of our modern media as being this kind of over the hill god who's like, again, lost his purpose and doesn't know what to do with the up and coming generation. And that just seems to be a constant theme, which is not necessarily how you thought about him in the original Greek mythology, where he's always concerned about like the generation overthrowing him, but he's very much still in power, not questioning his own role. So why do you guys think we still see this depiction of him basically like okay boomer status?
That was literally going to be my answer, was I think this is how like millennials and Gen Z sort of view like the boomer generation, as like out of touch and like unable to like have real conversations and maybe unconcerned with the state of the world, or unable to negotiate with the state of the world. And I feel like that is a lot of how we have Zeus in these more modern views of him. And before, if we have this huge respect for authority and respect for age and, the very old school, your senator is like the old white man with white hair, and you have to respect the president, whoever he is, all of that stuff. I feel that coming through of this, like, nah, that.
Yeah, that's curious. I never thought about that, but that at least would map onto it, especially because from a younger generation's perspective, the thing about Zeus, whatever you call him, to quote Aeschylus, right? He does have a lot of power, and it seems to be exercised completely arbitrarily, and that makes you feel really powerless. And when there are so many existential crises that you feel just crushing your soul on a daily basis, it's not great to have the supreme force that has controlled, that could fix things, to be so disconnected from the urgency that you feel.
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean that
Self-invested.
makes a lot of sense to me, right?
Yeah, I have one. Yeah, I completely agree with everything kind of Eli and Jason sort of just said, and as also I really like Jason's little nod for kids to go and read your Agamemnon.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? Oh yeah, but my other thought, my immediate thought, just this is a very colonist thought, is the meta answer. Whereas like our relationship to Zeus in this film is almost like our relationship to classical mythology or like sort of traditional myth storytellings and figures like that, right? Where it's like it's hokey and shoddy and out of touch and a little gaudy and a little over embellished or something. Like, it's I mean the emphasis on like that is like it's all very vain and gilded and like tacky, and sort of flip it, and on the sort of extra meta, not metal, the extra meta level is, I think, also casting Russell Crowe is almost like a genius meta move, because Russell Crowe kind of was the embodiment or spearheaded the last sort of great, or the last very popular golden age style sword and sandal Hollywood film, right? Where like Gladiator was kind of the last of an era, right? I mean, it was weirdly kind of disjointed in time, and that era most people were ready to put, or that genre of film most people were ready to put to bed. And Russell Crowe kind of embodied the modern version of that. But even now, I think a movie like Gladiator would feel a little bit pedantic or out of touch or overly didactic or something. Like its moral system is maybe too simplistic for us, or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I actually teach a class on Greece and Rome and world film. And the way I look at Gladiator is actually that it's like the reviving of that aesthetic. And I mean, from one perspective, you could say it sort of unleashed that energy again, because right after Gladiator, you get 300, you get Troy, you get
all the knockoffs, King Arthur. I mean, all the crappy ones we've reviewed on this show.
Yeah, all that stuff that, I guess is still happening. It doesn't seem like it's really stopped. I mean, it's not been as intense, but
every couple of years somebody takes a crack at it.
Yeah, because you get like Jon Snow in Pompeii or whatever. So
Gosh.
yeah, I actually didn't see that movie.
That's okay.
But
we had a lot of thoughts.
But so it's actually genius, because it's true. He is he hasn't really, his career has not really been doing a lot. I mean, I don't think it has for the last decade or so, maybe a couple things, and he'll forever be known. I mean, his obituary will be, this dude won an Oscar for playing a gladiator, right? And so it was an ingenious move, and I hope we get more of him. It seems like we're going to. I mean, I'm just making that inference on the basis of the Easter eggs at the end, but yeah, so it will be very interesting to see then how this is built on, because especially with the ideas about generational succession that you all have been bringing out, it'd be interesting to see that. Gladiator is an interesting one, because I think you're right. That was written right before, whatever. I guess it was written, but it came out right before 9/11. And so it definitely smacks of, if there ever is time in the last half century where you could talk about periodization happening overnight. Well, that's the day that it did.
Yeah.
And so it definitely feels like that was from an earlier period. And now I'm really dating myself because most of my students were long not even thought of as ideas before until much after 9/11.
This is my question, I guess also for you, Jason, because like, yeah, to most of us who were born in the 80s and 90s, Gladiator is like a modern or a recent film, right? Even though it is now 20 plus years old. But like, I wonder if like, do your students see Gladiator as like a modern film, or is it to them like, because it came out before most of them were probably born now, and is it like a weird dated film to them?
I purposefully and for self-preservation purposes present that class in a way so that they would be discouraged from making that conclusion because we start with like Spartacus.
Right.
It is an old film, and then of course everyone who's like slightly older than us will be like, it's not that old. But we start with that era, and then we hop around. But I no, in fact, what most commonly, because at the end of each time I teach this class, I ask students. We have a session where we just rank everything we've watched, and Gladiator regularly is in the top 3.
Wow.
Okay.
And I mean, and you name a film, and I've probably had it on the syllabus at one point, and it always wins out. So yeah, I mean, obviously Gladiator is a really good film, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say anything negative about it, but it still has some effect, even on, whatever we are now, Gen Z still.
Yeah, I only ask because literally just today, literally in the class I was teaching right before I came here, one of my students was talking about how his roommates are trying to get him into really old, like classic films. Because he says like, if it came out before like if it came out before like 2005, I've never seen it. And the films he was listing of like the classic films his roommates are making him watch were Silence of the Lambs, Seven. There was another one but it was all like, I heard this and I felt like I could feel the skin like wrinkling on my face.
That's violence. That is violence, what has been done.
I continuously have to fight students. I'm like, have you seen The Mummy? And they're like, the one with Tom Cruise? I'm like, no, that one is not allowed to exist. It's the real Mummy that everyone should watch.
The Mummy.
The Mummy.
Yeah.
Well, I had one more interesting observation, kind of throwing back to what Elijah said earlier about how we kind of look at our our older senators as authorities. Is another thing about Ragnarok is Odin literally passes the torch to the next generation of people. And like Anthony Hopkins goes out like a boss, basically, or like, yeah. And then Zeus, who you were like so frustrated with as this authority figure, you're just like, oh, he's dead. Nope. He's still alive and he has a vendetta now.
I mean, also another just dimension on that whole interaction is like, before we meet Zeus, Thor is like, I've based myself on this guy, right? Yeah. Which is fun because there are sort of Indo-European connections we can draw between Thor and Zeus and other figures, whatever. Like, but Zeus was like a model for Thor, and then he meets Zeus and he's like, ooh, he sucks.
I loved the interaction. He says something like, "Oh, lightning! Oh, thunder!" Like we're like like that. That made me smile. But it was definitely like meeting your heroes kind of moment. That made sense. Like, if you're ever actually going to meet Zeus, it's like, yeah, he sucks.
Right? Yeah. So I'm going to be very interested to see how this all plays out because, I mean, obviously we're getting more and more
stuff,
world mythological things coming in, right? It seems like the next Black Panther movie is going to get in some Mesoamerican things. Obviously with Moon Knight, we get ancient Egyptian things. So like, yeah, if we can like build up to like Avengers 8, the Titanomachy or something like that, that would be spectacular, right?
Yeah,
I'm down. Yeah, absolutely.
I was just gonna say, it's like that kind of leads me to the teaser at the end of the film is like, then we get Brett Goldstein coming on as Hercules, and that's, I guess my question is like, what do you guys think we're gonna do with Hercules? Because is it, we've just talked about him, it's like maybe Thor's actually reached enlightenment and we like haven't realized it yet, and you know, at what stage, as Heracles is a very tragic figure as well, you know, where is he emotionally and how is Thor going to contend with that?
I admittedly, I know that Hercules like is a Marvel character who's been in the comics since I think the 60s at least.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the 70s. But I know very little about him other than that he's just kind of like, to me, he sort of gets like lost in the sauce, and other characters like Thor kind of emerged a little bit more prominently. So I don't know a lot about Marvel's kind of take on Hercules or what he's going to be like, other than that he's just kind of a strong guy who shows up. And I think he fights Thor. I mean, it seems like a natural pairing, right? To have Hercules versus Thor. But
Yeah.
I don't know where to go from there.
I thought they should have made Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson Hercules.
Again, yeah.
That would have been awesome. Yeah.
Yes.
Although I like Roy Kent. He's good.
He's here. He's there. He's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. You know more than I do about what he does in the comics, but you know, I mean, again, just sort of the bigger conversation we've been having, he's just a very excellent character to think through these big issues of the way the universe is structured and where divinity begins and where humanity ends. The potential is there.
Yeah. Well, and isn't that kind of what the premise of Thor was in the very first episode, was this fish out of water element? And like you got that with Captain America too, which was like one of the most endearing things. He's like, wait, I got that reference, and sort of things. Was like he's dealing with the modern world. And that's something, if we look back at, you know, the plays about Heracles and how like his tragedies always occur not when he's going and doing labors, but when he's trying to come back home to a domestic space and a normal life, and it ends horribly every time. And you know, I'm wondering how far they would take that characteristic with, you know, is he just gonna be a frenemy of Thor, or is he going to have a little bit of his own storyline where he has to deal with PTSD, deal with not being the biggest hero on the block? Because it, you know, every time I think Greek heroes, he's the top of the list most of the time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm wondering then if we could see Heracles as like as almost a villain in that sense. If we think about villains that we like really feel for and really agree with in so many ways, and just are sort of, you know, caught out by their methods, that if Heracles, you know, has all of this trauma and just wants to try to do his best and can't seem to get it right, if he is then cast as the villain, I think that would maybe not be the right choice, but I think would be an interesting vision of Hercules that we haven't really seen before.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the great thing about that character is that he at least in Greco-Roman literature, transcended genre and looked very differently depending on which genre he's in. So, you know, he could easily have comic relief, which would make sense for
Totally.
The Roy Kent side of
Yeah.
like comically angry drunkard or something. Not that Roy Kent's a drunkard, but or exactly what you're saying. That would make a lot of sense too. So I don't know.
This leads me to kind of another question of like that again, like introducing Zeus and Hercules and even to a lesser extent Thor kind of in this world where like, so like when we're in Omnipotence City and we're talking and Natalie Portman is like the Zeus, we're talking about like that guy, which like, you know, obviously like there's already a mythological tradition on Earth of these people. And so like to that extent, like have Hercules' stories like happened? Is there some truth out there? Like has this Hercules at some point in time like murdered his family or done all the other stuff that Heracles is or Hercules is said to have done? Or I mean, obviously there's a little bit of, you know, spicing it up. But like, I guess like the question of like, wait, is there, you know, obviously there's some truth to the myths, which like it like leads down. And again, when you like this to kind of like put my main a thing that I kept coming back to when I was watching this film is like there are these questions that get sort of implied by certain things that happened in this movie or in comics generally that like when I pull on that thread, it leads me down a madness spiral. Like I have a section at the bottom of my notes that just says mounting questions that I can come back to at the end, but of just like all of the things, like all of these kinds of questions that like the implications of which are far reaching and to me unsettling.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, there's like an Easter egg in one of the first episodes of Moon Knight where he has on his shelf like books of location there, which is not just there. It's also in other places in the MCU. Is that we humans in the MCU have received these stories. It just turns out that the characters are real. So that would make me think you're right. That yeah, that guy did some bad things a long time ago, and we
Mhm.
just have the stories, and that could be explored, right?
Yeah.
Now I just want Thor and Hercules sitting at a bar telling each other stories, like Thor telling stories about what his brother Loki did to him, and then Hercules going into the year he spent cross-dressing.
Mhm.
Right.
When I was a baby, my mother sent 2 snakes into my crib, strangled. I could totally see Brett
Yeah.
Goldstein like telling that, so like, and I strangled them, or
Or
like
like
that was not a very good Brett Goldstein impersonation, but like you know what he talks like.
another one that would be amazing is in the same way that like Sam Neill and Matt Damon play characters in the plays. If that's where they got The Rock to play Hercules in like a play about Hercules that's modeled on Sophocles or something,
That'd be
Yeah.
awesome.
that might make my brain explode though to have such thick intertextuality. I
Well,
don't.
they do. They're really like. I mean, I guess this is maybe the final phase of like Marvel's supremacy because like they can do something like in WandaVision. I forget the actor's name, but the guy who plays the Flash in the X-Men movies over at Fox
Yes.
shows up as like
Yes.
alternate version Flash, and then
Mhm.
there's a bunch of other stuff like that. I'm trying to remember. I mean, in the early films, like Lou Ferrigno has a cameo in the Hulk movie.
Yeah, that's true.
But like now it's like they're very much calling attention to like I don't know if you saw the final episode of She-Hulk yet, but like
Yep.
that like
No.
completely. I don't want to give away too much because it just
Please
came out
don't.
yesterday. Okay, never mind.
I'm like set to watch it tonight with.
Oh, okay. You want to talk about meta?
Yeah.
That one that it like completely
Mhm.
like shatters the fourth
Great.
wall. Or like bringing in Daredevil into that show, right? Or like now like
Yeah.
like
Love
these
that
characters
so
are like
much.
cross, but in a way like this is very true to the spirit of
Mhm.
mythology, right? Of just having
Yeah.
these kinds like it doesn't have to. I always tell my students like there's no canon. Forget canon. Stop trying to reconcile it. Like it plays by the rules of fan fiction.
Exactly.
It's true.
Yeah.
Okay. I have one of my big mounting questions that I need to ask people to get your thoughts, which is it's kind of related, but it has to do with Thor's hammer. 2-part question. 1, how much of Thor's power is tied to his hammer? And 2, is his hammer or hammers, are they sentient? Because this movie seems to posit that they are.
Yes.
Yeah. Because, like, isn't that the whole point of when they get drunk and they have the hammer on the table and only the worthy one can pick it up? And Captain America is like, go back to that later.
Like I knew it.
Yeah. I think the sentience aspect has always been there to some degree.
I would agree with that.
Okay. And like
They-
therefore
they
because his
seem
hammer is
to
like
have,
feel
like-
jealousy towards one another.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, they seem to have personalities in some way and like have feelings, I guess. So if not sentience, at least personality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, like, I loved the dynamic of Thor talking to, like, what is essentially his ex-girlfriend weapon and current girlfriend weapon sort of situation. And it's like one of those things that would have been so funny in other contexts, but like that was constantly going into these moments of like him and Jane having a frank discussion of like what happened with their relationship and things like that. It's like that's really funny in another context, but like right now it's like I don't need that at the moment. So as to your other question, what is Thor without the hammer? Isn't that like the question of like what's Iron Man without the suit and what's blah 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 nah.
Well, I only asked this because my like pedantic nerd brain is like in the first movie, it's kind of implied that his power is tied to the hammer, and when Odin takes the hammer away, he's basically just a regular person, albeit 6'4" and built like a brick shithouse, but still human.
Mm-hmm.
But then in like Ragnarok, for example, like without his hammer, he can still like fight the Hulk. And then this is like leads into my other questions were like, is that just Thor or are all Asgardians like super strong or like is Thor special among Asgardians? And like this is the kind of like we don't necessarily need to I'm gonna pull down this podcast into just like the pedantry of like nerd debates, but So stop me if this is getting too.
I was gonna say that's treading into dangerous waters that we.
I know. Immediately after, I just had a big appeal to like, there's no such thing as canon. It doesn't have to make sense. And now I'm like, but why doesn't it make sense? Zeus does not have the monopoly on hypocrisy, I guess.
Well, and his thunderbolt gets stolen, and
That's true.
but then there's other myths that are like, but his true form is a thunderbolt. So really,
So he is the Thunderbolt. Yeah. Yeah, and also like at the end when Thor kind of imbues all of the kids with his Thor power, and he was like, grab a thing, right? Like grab a weapon. And that one kid just has like the bunny rabbit, right? And it is like imbued with the power not because it's a weapon, but because it's like part of this duo with the child who is going to wield it. And I guess maybe it's like you can't, like the hammer doesn't do anything on its own. Like it needs a human involvement to sort of wield the power through it. But like Thor maybe can't be fully Thor without wielding his power through a hammer conduit. So they are like two parts of one whole.
And then like a further datum for this is that when Steve Rogers wields it, it's not like he's slinging lightning when he swings it. It's just
But he is. He shoots lightning out of it, doesn't he? At one point,
I thought he just like.
I just
thought
thought
he just like hit people.
I will get on YouTube and I will find the clip. He 100% shoot lightning out of it.
Well, so that would be interesting if he does.
Yeah,
I believe you. I could be misremembering that. If he does, then it's still a good data point, right? For like what we're trying to figure out, because we've got he uses it pretty extensively. Certainly, whatever it is, it's not that he doesn't have the full power of lightning the way that Thor does when he uses those things. Yeah. Like I don't remember him ever doing anything like what Thor can do.
I'm linking something in the chat.
I'm like, I have something also on the internet. It says Captain America was able to channel Thor's lightning powers.
Yeah, you're right. I see
Thor was nearby and willed it to be.
All right, this is that like when you've got like a bunch of
11-year-olds moment from the movie that we don't know about. That's what the answer was.
This is like when 11-year-olds are playing a game together. It's like, well, my thing beats your thing. Well, like I have the extra special thing that like negate. It's I have a dinosaur that eats force field dogs, right? Like the way Andy plays in Toy Story.
So you're correct, Colin. I think we have to assume that Mjolnir is a conduit for lightning regardless of who is wielding it. I'm convinced of that.
I mean, anyone can generate static electricity and you just zit with it.
Fair enough, Christy. Yeah. Fair enough.
So I have a question. It goes a little bit back to Gore the God Killer, but I was kind of as a figure of like entities killing gods. It's like that isn't to me seem as prominent in mythology. You might have like general end times, but and the only equivalent I could think of in Greek mythology was I think it's Typhus, where like Hera very intentionally tried to create something that would overthrow Zeus and do some damage to him. But I was kind of curious about that as a precedent.
I guess it's an interesting point, right? Because like even like in the language itself, like the word for gods is literally like the deathless or the undying or immortals or whatever. Like they're defined by the fact that they don't die. And then beings like, like the Titans are not necessarily killed. They're just like imprisoned sort of indefinitely or like can you kill it? I mean, the closest thing that I can think of is there's that myth and it's kind of a deep cut B-side myth of Dionysus getting ripped apart, but then getting reassembled. So I guess I don't know. Can a god die in a Greek myth or in a Norse myth? Kind of. Yeah, they can die. Yeah. Because Odin dies at Ragnarok, as does Thor. Like they're all destined to die, but then they get reborn anyways. So it's kind of weird.
Yeah, it may be a more Germanic thing with the Götterdämmerung, and it doesn't seem to me that's. Well, let me put it another way. It seems to me that in the Greco-Roman tradition, like mortality is the really important thing, right? That is the defining character, the defining characteristic, and the thing that divides humans from gods, and gives different perspectives. So it's just in general, it seems to me that no, that's not a thing that happens.
Yeah.
I just found his character an interesting premise in that regard, because that's not necessarily something, and we only see one god actually be killed. We're told of others,
Yeah.
but we only see it happen to one, and it's not a god that any human would recognize as a god.
Yeah.
Or at least
Yeah.
not be familiar with. So
I feel like we don't really like see the consequences. Like what are the consequences of killing a god? Like is the faith itself then like disappear, and everyone who is like, I don't want to say reliant upon, but like is, benefits from any form of faith, is that then taken away?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's, again, like, the movie maybe doesn't set up the stakes or the rules or something as clear as we might like. Because, like, the closest thing, I think, is maybe the very first set piece where that priest king guy, I think, says something to the effect of, like, our gods are dead, so we were left vulnerable. And so the Guardians and Thor had to come in to help us out.
Right.
The idea that these gods normally would have been protecting them from the Muppet owl guys from the beginning.
Right.
Right.
And then that they're not. So, like, yeah, we don't actually necessarily, like, it is, the movie doesn't necessarily convince us that Gore going around massacring gods is inherently bad. The only reason we kind of care is because he kidnaps a bunch of Asgardian children.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, because even we see at the end that both Odin and Jane Foster are now in Valhalla,
Right.
and exist for the opportunity to be resurrected in some future franchise or whatever. So yeah, I think you're right. The stakes aren't whether Thor is going to live or die. It's just a matter of, can you get these kids back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or what would happen if, because Asgard's in a particular place, or it's interesting because, like, if the Asgardians were, say, destroyed, Earth it would be rough for Asgard, but, like, Earth isn't dependent on Asgard, at least not anymore. Or, like, and I think in the earlier movies they used to set up that, like, Asgard's role in the Nine Realms was that it protected Earth from other bigger forces out there in the cosmos, which now the power dynamic is flipped because now the Asgardians are refugees on Earth.
Right.
And which is, again, I think an interesting implication that we don't really, it's just a bunch of, like, Disneyland jokes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the problem MCU is going to run into. I view it as the same problem that Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball has, is like, how many power-ups can you really go? How high can you raise the stakes before we're just like, I don't know, like we've gotten rid of all the rules at this point, and like this doesn't feel real anymore. This has gone beyond just myth to, like, straight up.
Where do you go after eternity, right? Like,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I know for sure. I was thinking, like, Gore. The more I think about this, the more I think that this is another lost opportunity, because there could have been a lot more, and maybe there still will be. Who knows? But if we're just judging this movie on its own merits, it definitely could have explored a lot further. Precisely what we're talking about is what is at stake if gods can be killed for the MCU, right? But again, maybe we'll find out. I mean, they still haven't addressed the fact that there's some big, huge thing
statue,
that this clearly caused tsunamis that covered 30% of the earth, and no one's really talking about that. But whatever.
It was. There's some Easter eggs in She-Hulk where, like, when she's on her
really?
laptop, you see little news stories like, why is there a hand coming out of the ocean?
No way. Oh my God. I miss those. That's great.
I watched on YouTube a series, and they did, like, a bunch of things that She-Hulk answered about the MCU, and so that was one of them.
Captain America's virginity.
Yeah, that one was great. And then another one is one of the others, like, on her laptop, one of the side stories was also man in bar brawl has metal claws coming from his hands. So, like, we're getting more references to X-Men too.
Excellent.
Love it.
So
yeah, no, I read, like, a very deep dive on exactly the destruction that would have been unleashed by that thing in terms of the human death, that if how many humans would die from the displacement of ocean water.
No.
I'm gonna just embarrass myself on mic, but I'll do it anyways. But of, like, a thing that, like, definitely we used to talk about in college is just the theory called, I think it's like the Endor Holocaust or something like that. But it's the idea that, like, at the end of Return of the Jedi, if something as big as the Death Star blew up that close to a planet like Endor, like it would be like dinosaur extinction level events.
Absolutely. Yeah, they didn't, and that's never addressed.
And then I posted a link, so that's the YouTube. I would watch it after you've watched the last episode of She-Hulk because it's like top 10 questions answered.
Excellent. I will watch it tonight because that's the plan is to get caught up on that. And I have watched Werewolf by Night, so then I'll be fully caught up.
Is that good?
I loved it.
I might watch it tonight because like it's straight up my alley.
It is, the creative people on it were both writers on WandaVision and Hawkeye.
Okay.
It's a really interesting combo because actually the energy is a mashup of those two shows in a very interesting way. And then, like the main character, I can't remember her name, but she's like I don't know if y'all saw The Nevers. It's like that aborted Joss Whedon show right before he got canceled.
Yeah.
Was annoying because I started watching it and was like, this is great, and I didn't know anything about it. And then as the end credits went on the last episode, it was like created by, written by, directed by, produced by Joss Whedon, and I was like, no. But it's so good, it really is. And so she's the main. I think she now will be a fixture in the MCU, so that's great because she's phenomenal. Anyway, it's good. Y'all should watch it.
Okay, this looks really cool. Yeah, I hadn't heard of this actually.
It like they've not made a huge deal out of it because it's like a one-off thing for the season, the Halloween season, and then of course it's introducing characters that we'll probably see again. Because I don't know the comics as well, but I think like what it's riffing on is like the Monster Hunters Guild that Blade is involved with. So it's like
I was wondering
when they do the Blade movies, that will be riffing on this same thing.
One of my favorite stories is apparently so Mahershala Ali is gonna be Blade, and the way that happened is Mahershala Ali just walked into Kevin Feige's office and was like, "I'm gonna be Blade," and Kevin Feige was like, "Sounds great."
He'd be a great Blade. That's
no notes. He would probably already would have been a top pick for Blade anyways. So
right.
Love it. I love it.
All right, so. Should we end it there? Any final questions that people need to any final thoughts that people need to get out there into the void?
I stand by my not fully digging it.
I guess we had a reverse, I guess, because usually the arc of the show is me slowly convincing Eli that she actually likes a bad movie. Yeah. But this is, I think, maybe us convincing Jason to not like a good movie.
Well, I remember, anyone listening to this is going to be absolutely confused because the first thing I said is I liked it, and then I've been pretty critical of it throughout this. But I guess the point is, I liked it more than what I thought I would, given that I had seen the critical reception before I watched it.
Sure.
I didn't watch it until it came on Disney Plus.
Same.
So, but no, my basic assessment is it is unfair. It's existentially unfair because it's Taika against himself, and that's never going to be fair to him, especially when it's Ragnarok, which I don't know if he will ever do anything that's as good as that again, right? Yeah. But then also it was a pretty disjointed plot, but I in anticipation of this, I looked up on Rotten Tomatoes. I believe now that Thor 4 is rated worse than Thor 2, which doesn't make sense.
That's not.
This is just the weirdness of. Yeah. Well, one, I think there's also a bunch of bad actors out there in the review boards that review bomb and dislike movies for the wrong reasons. But
because there was a female Thor, so
Well, I think we can also be critical of things that we really enjoy, right? I think that there is room for both of those things.
Also, there's a weird trend in pop culture where sometimes movies that aren't good and weren't understood as good later develop some kind of weird appreciation. The way the Star Wars prequels, people now will argue that they are in fact good. And I saw the same thing happening with the Hobbit trilogy. Yeah, that I'm that people will hold them yes, the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, two trilogies of equal value or of equal caliber. And I'm did you watch the Hobbit movies?
Well, and I always do that thing where in some ways maybe I'm giving more credit to the film than I should in terms of like maybe we don't like this movie of Thor because he's a character who like actually has dealt with his trauma and like we don't know what that looks like and it doesn't resonate with us. So
Yeah. Another part of it too is that it is the phase 4 has been so scattered that a lot of the other, phases 1 through 3, you can forgive them a lot more because it was so much more cohesive. Certainly by phase 2, it was like we're on track for something.
Yep.
Yeah.
And each one was building on other ones. And so most of the stuff so far, some of it hasn't, but most of it has been standalone stuff. And so if it's not great like WandaVision, then you're going to be, it's not going to be something that you're as invested in.
And it's also just reaching a point of like, you can't watch it all now. Like there was a time, for a couple of years you could watch all the Marvel films, and that is becoming increasingly
difficult. Yes.
So they need to like.
Yes, I too find that difficult because I'm very busy.
Well, and I think with this last phase, because there's not really been one of their short series they've released on Disney Plus that I haven't liked. Versus like, so I loved WandaVision, and then she comes into the Doctor Strange, and I'm like, no.
Part of that is, again, like, the other elephant in the room is the pandemic, which like kind of messed everything up and it rearranged the schedules. Like WandaVision was supposed to come out much later in the pipeline, and it got bumped up, and that messed up Doctor Strange. Like when they made Doctor Strange, they didn't really know how WandaVision was going to be or like how it was going to end. So actually there's like a little bit of disconnect there of like the Wanda we see at the end of WandaVision and her at the start of Doctor Strange. So there's like practical reasons, I think, that, but I'm like getting into a whole thing, and I need to let everyone know,
because that to me is the greatest sin that's ever been perpetrated in the MCU is what they did to Wanda after WandaVision, which is the best thing they've done in the MCU in my opinion.
Yeah,
and it was supremely, even though I actually liked that movie quite a bit, but it was very difficult for me to get over what they did to Wanda. It's terrible. But yes,
I agree.
And I agree at pretty much everything that's come out as standalone stuff has been great. I've really liked it a lot. Obviously we can nitpick things, but it's a good, as
we just spent the last hour doing. What would we be if not academics to do this? Okay, so I think that's a good place to kind of call it. Before we say our goodbyes and let you go, Jason, is there anything you want to plug for listeners where they can find you on the internet or elsewhere?
My internet presence, such as it is probably, you can find me on Twitter more than anywhere else. My handle's just Jason Nethercut, and I'm tucked away most days, teaching and writing various things, but I don't really have any projects that are looming or coming out right now, but be alive to that if you're interested in Latin poetry.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. In that case, as always, you can find our podcasts on movieswedig.com, as well as services like Stitcher and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, stuff like that. Please remember to like, review, and subscribe, and follow us on Twitter at @DigMovies. And until then, I'll see you guys all later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.